Early 1961 placed the United States at a dangerous edge. The Cold War shaped almost every major decision because Washington treated Soviet influence as something that spread if it went unchallenged. Then Cuba changed everything. A revolution had swept Fidel Castro into power, and the island stopped being a familiar neighbor and started looking like a possible enemy base. It sat just 90 miles from Florida. That distance felt like nothing. American leaders worried less about Cuba alone and more about what Cuba could become. If Moscow gained a reliable partner there, the Soviets gained a front door into the Americas. It meant intelligence stations, military support, and the chance to project power into a region the United States had long considered its own sphere. Containment was the guiding idea of the era, and Cuba looked like a crack in the wall. So pressure built quickly inside Washington. The public heard broad warnings about communism and national security, but behind the scenes, the urgency became more specific. Stop Cuba from turning into a permanent Soviet foothold. The problem was that every available option carried risk. Doing nothing looked weak. Acting openly risked backlash at home and abroad, and in that narrowing space, the government began searching for answers that felt decisive. In April 1961, Washington backed a risky plan meant to solve the Cuba problem quickly. A force of Cuban exiles, trained and supported in secret by the United States, prepared to land on the island and trigger an uprising against Castro. The idea sounded simple. Hit fast, inspire revolt, and watch his government crack. But the margin for error stayed thin. And the moment the operation began, that thin margin disappeared. The invasion landed at the Bay of Pigs and immediately ran into reality. Local support did not surge the way planners expected. Cuban forces reacted faster than predicted, and the attackers faced overwhelming pressure on the beaches and in the air. US help stayed limited, partly to keep deniability, and that restraint mattered. Supply lines broke, momentum died. Within days, the invasion collapsed, leaving prisoners, dead fighters, and a public failure the world could see. The defeat did more than embarrass Washington. It reshaped how US leaders judged Castro. He did not look fragile anymore. He looked dug in, alert, and able to rally his country when threatened. For many in the military and intelligence world, the lesson felt blunt. Half measures failed, and expecting him to fall from one sharp push felt like wishful thinking. The Bay of Pigs became a turning point, and it pushed decision-makers toward tougher, riskier thinking. In the months after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy faced a choice. He could pull back, accept Cuba as a permanent problem, and avoid another disaster. Or he could keep pressure on Castro without risking an open war. He chose pressure. The White House authorized a tougher covert campaign. Quiet actions meant to weaken the Cuban government from the inside while keeping US fingerprints off the operation. That decision changed everything inside Washington. Covert action meant more money, more planning, and more agencies involved. The CIA had room to propose bigger operations, and the Pentagon watched closely, impatient with half measures. Each failure pushed the next idea to go further. The mission became less about collecting information and more about forcing outcomes, disrupting Cuba, stirring resistance, and setting conditions for something larger. But covert pressure had a built-in trap. If secrecy mattered, proof was hard to show, and success was hard to measure. Military leaders wanted a clear path to a decisive end, not an endless cycle of sabotage and denials. As Kennedy approved more aggressive steps behind the curtain, planners started thinking in terms of dramatic triggers, events that could move public opinion and remove political limits. The bold ideas began to multiply. By late 1961, the approach toward Cuba shifted again. This time it had a name: Operation Mongoose. It did not mean a single raid or one bold strike. It meant a coordinated campaign designed to hit the Cuban government from the inside and the outside at the same time. The goal stayed simple on paper: weaken Castro's control, disrupt the economy, and push the island toward collapse. Mongoose leaned on sabotage and subversion, covert actions meant to damage systems without announcing US involvement. Planners looked for pressure points that could be struck quietly: supply lines, communications, and key parts of daily life that made a government look competent. Each small action aimed to create a bigger effect: confusion, fear, and the sense that the regime could not protect its own country. But results did not arrive on schedule. As the campaign expanded, impatience spread through the military chain of command. Many officers saw months of hidden operations and measured steps, but no clear breakthrough. The pressure to produce something undeniable kept rising because the stakes kept feeling urgent and close to home. Mongoose, meant to be the answer after earlier failure, started to look like another slow grind. Frustration did not disappear. It hardened. By early 1962, the pressure inside Washington did not ease. It tightened. At the center of the military's Cuba planning stood General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He sat above the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines as the president's top uniformed advisor. And now the chiefs did not just want more covert action, they wanted a clear path to invasion. The Joint Chiefs faced a problem that was as political as it was military. An invasion required public support, and public support required a reason that felt unavoidable. Castro had to look like the aggressor, not the target. So the chiefs began shaping a formal proposal, not as a battlefield plan, but as a way to create an undeniable public rationale. In their view, the obstacle was not capability, it was justification. This was the moment the planning turned sharper and more deliberate. Lemnitzer and the chiefs worked through how an argument for war could be made to stick, even under scrutiny. They pushed beyond general frustrations and into specific mechanisms that could trigger action. The goal stayed simple and blunt: a pretext the country could rally behind. Once that existed, a full-scale move against Cuba could follow quickly. In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs put their thinking into writing. The document carried a name that sounded harmless: Operation Northwoods. But the idea underneath it was blunt. If the public would not support an invasion of Cuba without a clear trigger, then a trigger could be manufactured, not a rumor. Not a vague suggestion, a menu of staged incidents designed to look real enough to demand an American response. Northwoods laid out scenarios that flipped normal warfare on its head. Planners proposed fabricated hijackings, including creating a fake civilian aircraft incident that could be blamed on Cuba. They considered using a stand-in plane, making it appear passengers had been attacked or lost, then guiding the story through controlled details. The goal stayed consistent: produce headlines and outrage, then point directly at Havana with evidence that looked convincing. Other proposals went further, towards staged violence close to home. The paper described fake attacks on US targets and manipulated signs of Cuban involvement, so investigators and the public would reach the same conclusion. It even suggested planting or shaping proof after the fact, so the case seemed airtight. This was not about winning a battle. It was about building permission for war, using a story engineered from the start. In March 1962, the Northwoods package left the Pentagon and moved up the civilian chain of command. It reached Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, the man who stood between the uniformed military and the President. Now it was no longer a brainstorming exercise inside the Joint Chiefs. It was a request for permission. The plan asked the US government to approve actions that would look like Cuban aggression and use that public shock to open the door to war. From McNamara, the idea went to President Kennedy. That changed everything. Kennedy had already supported intense pressure on Castro, but Northwoods crossed a different line. It relied on deception aimed at Americans, not just covert action abroad. It treated public opinion as something to be engineered with staged violence and manufactured proof. This was the moment when the question stopped being how to deal with Cuba and became how far the United States would go to justify an invasion. The answer came back from the White House as a rejection. The administration did not authorize a made-for-TV casus belli, even if it promised the kind of clear, simple story that could rally the country overnight. Northwoods died at the decision point where it needed presidential approval to become real. The pressure to confront Cuba remained, but this route was cut off. In that refusal, civilian leadership asserted a limit, and the military's most extreme proposal went nowhere. After the White House turned down Northwoods, the message to the Pentagon was unmistakable. The military could plan, but it would not set the political trigger. Inside Washington, that rejection carried consequences. General Lyman Lemnitzer did not lose his rank overnight, but he lost something just as important: influence. His standing with the president weakened, and the space for the most extreme proposals narrowed fast. In 1962, leadership shifted in a quieter, more procedural way. Lemnitzer's term as chairman ended, and he was moved out of the center of decision-making. The administration tightened civilian control over Cuba policy, demanding clearer chains of approval and fewer freelancing ideas from the uniformed leadership. Plans still moved forward, but they moved under stricter supervision. The president and McNamara kept the final say, and they used it. But sidelining one man did not reduce the pressure of the moment. The Cuba crisis kept intensifying, driven by fear that the island was becoming a permanent Soviet platform near US shores. Covert action continued, and military options stayed on the table, but now the priority was discipline and control, not manufactured incidents. The stakes rose anyway, and the margin for error shrank with every passing month of 1962. In the 1990s, the Cold War ended, and the government slowly opened old files that had stayed locked away for decades. What once lived as whispers and speculation started to face a harder test: paper. Declassification did not bring opinions or second-hand memories. It brought dated memos, official headings, and signatures. Operation Northwoods stopped being a story people argued about. It became a record people could read. As those documents surfaced, the details landed with force. The proposals described staged incidents designed to look like Cuban aggression, with the goal of creating public support for war. This time, the proof did not depend on trust in a source. It sat in black and white, inside the language of planners who treated deception as an option on the table. For many Americans, the shock came from that simple fact. Once the files entered the public domain, Operation Northwoods shifted again. It no longer functioned as a rumor that could be dismissed or exaggerated. It became a documented artifact of how far some officials once considered going under pressure. Researchers and journalists could cite it directly, line by line, without guessing at motives or intent. The plan's rejection mattered, but the existence of the plan now carried its own weight. Once the Northwoods papers became public, they stopped being just a Cold War curiosity. They became a warning label. In 1961, fear moved faster than facts, and secrecy kept decisions inside a small circle. The public never weighed the risks, because the public never even knew the proposal existed. That gap mattered. It showed how quickly a democracy could drift toward extreme options when oversight stayed weak. Decades later, the contrast looked sharp. More records surfaced. More journalists and watchdogs dug in. Congress and courts carried more expectation of scrutiny, even if imperfect. But transparency created a new problem, raw material for suspicion. Northwoods fed a simple, dangerous idea that governments always lied and any crisis could be staged. A plan that got rejected still ended up poisoning trust because it proved the unthinkable got written down. In the modern world, information warfare thrived on that mistrust. False stories spread faster than corrections, and real history got bent into proof of whatever someone already believed. Northwoods became a case study in two directions at once: why civilian oversight had to stay relentless, and why audiences had to learn to separate documented fact from recycled rumor. The Cold War demanded secrecy. Today demanded accountability and still struggled to hold the line.